Hello and welcome to English for Philosophy students. We are studying Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. I believe today is the 54th lesson, and it is lesson number 7 in our consideration of rule number 7, which is that you should strive to get what is meaningful rather than what is expedient. Last week, we finished a large section, and I want to reread the last little bit so we can remind ourselves the end of the last section as we move into the next section. So, we are ending last week's study with the idea that if you abide truthfully and courageously by the highest of ideals, you will be provided with more security and strength than will be offered by any short-sighted concentration on your own safety. If you live properly, fully, you can discover meaning so profound that it protects you even from the fear of death. So the idea is that virtuous living rewards us in a deep way and makes us invulnerable even to the fear of death. But the next question is, could that possibly be true? And now we move into a consideration, more deep consideration of whether last statement is true. Okay. So, I'm going to just make this mark here. And I'm going to give myself a note that we're beginning here. Okay, let us read. Death, toil, and evil. The tragedy of self-conscious being produces suffering, inevitable suffering. That suffering, in turn, motivates the desire for selfish, immediate gratification, for expediency. But sacrifice and work serves far more effectively than short-term impulsive pleasure at keeping suffering at bay. However, tragedy itself, conceived of as the arbitrary harshness of society and nature, set against the vulnerability of the individual, is not the only, and perhaps not even the primary, source of suffering. There is also the problem of evil to consider. The world is set hard against us, of a certainty, but man's inhumanity to man is something even worse. Thus, the problem of sacrifice is compounded in its complexity. It is not only privation and mortal limitation that must be addressed by work, by the willingness to offer and to give up. It is the problem of evil as well. Let us begin again at the beginning. The tragedy of self-conscious being produces suffering. So tragedy, we later find out, here it's defined for us. Hold on. It's defined as the arbitrary harshness. Arbitrary means without reason, just random, for no reason, like being struck by lightning. No reason. So the arbitrary harshness of society and nature. So tragedy is defined as the bad things that happen to vulnerable people because of nature and because of the way society is. Maybe there is a shortage of food, or maybe, there's all kinds of dangers that can hurt people. So that is what they're calling tragedy. And these terrible dangers in the natural world affect self-conscious being. So people who are self-conscious. A dog, for example, is not afraid if a tornado is coming because he doesn't understand future, he doesn't understand weather, he doesn't even know he exists. So dogs are not self-conscious beings, but people who can know the future, they can hope to see their children grow up, look at a tornado coming, and they're afraid. So, tragedy, meaning natural disasters, affect self-conscious beings to produce suffering. Inevitable suffering. Inevitable means there is no escape. Everybody will experience suffering because of tragedy, because of the dangers of nature, combined with the vulnerability of humans. And that suffering, in turn, that suffering motivates the desire for selfish immediate gratification, for expediency. So if you are suffering, you want to feel good. You want to have immediate pleasure, to feel better. Or you may say, because of tragedy, this tornado is coming. It will destroy everything. I may as well eat and drink and get drunk because tomorrow I will die. So the reality of this suffering makes people want to have expediency. They want to have immediate pleasure and not work or save or sacrifice in the present to have a better future. Because they say tragedy will come and I will have no future. So tragedy motivates the desire for expediency. But we are advised to search for meaning, not expediency. Okay, so tragedy motivates us to desire expediency. But sacrifice and work serves. Okay, so let me make this smaller. sacrifice, and then we have this thing here, and work. But this verb here has an S on it. The structure of the sentence is, but sacrifice serves far more effectively than short-term impulsive pleasure at keeping suffering at bay. So, sacrifice keeps suffering at bay. Keep at bay means keeps it away. If you have a lion attacking you, you can pick up a chair and keep the lion at bay by poking the chair here, and the lion cannot get to you. So keep it at bay. You keep suffering at bay with sacrifice. This thing here allows you to insert more meaning. So the more meaning is and work. Sacrifice and work keep suffering at bay. So sacrifice and work are more effective at keeping suffering at bay. So they are better for keeping suffering at bay than short-term impulsive pleasure. So we have tragedy. This makes us want to be expedient, to eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. But we find that work and sacrifice keep the suffering at bay better than short-term eat, drink, and tomorrow we die. So sacrifice and work do a better job of keeping suffering away from us than simply pleasuring ourselves. However, so this is going to be something different. However, tragedy itself, conceived as the arbitrary harshness of society and nature set against the vulnerability of the individual. So, however, tragedy itself is not the only source of suffering. You notice I did not read the inserted information. First, we want to see the root of the sentence. So the root of the sentence is tragedy is not the only source of suffering. There are other sources of suffering besides tragedy. And here it defined tragedy as those hazards, those dangers that are intrinsic to the harsh world we live in. Things like natural disasters, disease, illness, famine and want and poverty and war, all kinds of things that happen in society and nature that are always there. That's tragedy. But this is not the only source of human suffering. The other source is the problem of evil. Okay, so let us also look at the rest of the sentence. Okay, so, however, meaning something different than tragedy causes suffering. However, tragedy itself, meaning tragedy alone, all right, wait. Tragedy itself is not the only, and perhaps not even the primary source of suffering. So it's not the only source, and it may not, tragedy may not even be the primary, the number one source, the major source. There may be a bigger source of suffering. There may be a bigger reason why human beings suffer than tragedy. What is that reason? It is the problem of evil. The world is set hard against us, of a certainty. Okay, so that is related to this idea here. Okay, the world is set hard against us, of a certainty. Of a certainty just means certainly. Definitely. Definitely it is true that the world, the natural world, and the world of society is set against us, which means it is dangerous to us and hurtful to us. Yes, but, here we have our but, just like our however, but, I'm going to go to blue now. Man's inhumanity to man is even worse. So, man's inhumanity to man is something even worse. So, evil of man against man is worse than the random, impersonal damage done to vulnerable people by the world, the cosmos. Thus, meaning, and so we see the problem of sacrifice is compounded in its complexity. It is not only privation and mortal limitation that must be addressed by work, but the willingness, addressed by work, by the willingness to offer and to give up. It is the problem of evil as well. Okay, so earlier we said that sacrifice and work are good at holding off the suffering caused by tragedy. Now we see that sacrifice, the problem of holding off suffering with sacrifice, is compounded and made more complex by the introduction of evil, human evil, into the equation. It is not only privation and mortal limitation. That's these things. That's the natural world. Not only more privation, which means not having enough, being hungry or poor. And mortal limitation means you could be killed by a tornado or a tree falling on you or sickness. It's not only those things which must be addressed by work, and work is defined as the willingness to offer and to give up. That's sacrifice and work. It is the problem of evil as well. So, somehow, the problem of evil must be addressed by work. And work is defined as the willingness to offer and to give up. All right, let's move on. Consider once again the story of Adam and Eve. life becomes very hard for their children, Adam and Eve's children. Remember, we spoke of Cain, Abel, and another son named Seth a little bit later. All right, so life becomes very hard for their children. And he says, that's us. We are the children, sons of Adam, daughters of Eve. Life became very hard for them after the fall of man and awakening of our archetypal parents. Okay, so life becomes hard after the fall and simultaneously the awakening into self-consciousness of Adam and Eve, our archetypal parents. First is the terrible fate awaiting us in the post-paradisal world, the world of history. Not the least of this is what Goethe called our creative, endless toil. Humans work, as we have seen. We work because we have awakened to the truth of our own vulnerability, our subjugation to disease and death. And we wish to protect ourselves for as long as possible. Once we can see the future, we must prepare for it, or live in denial and terror. We therefore sacrifice the pleasures of today for the sake of a better tomorrow. But the realization of mortality and the necessity of work is not the only revelation to Adam and Eve when they eat the forbidden fruit, wake up, and open their eyes. They were also granted, or cursed by, the knowledge of good and evil. So let us read this paragraph again. So remember, going into it, we were talking about how human beings we suffer because of tragedy in the world, natural disasters, our own vulnerability, but even more because of human evil. And then he goes into this paragraph and he says, consider the story of Adam and Eve. Life becomes hard for their children. So the world we are in now is hard since the fall of man, which means before Adam and Eve ate the fruit and sinned, life was paradise. After, it became tragic. It became full of death and suffering. So, at the fall of man, the world as we know it began to be harsh. The world as we know it began at the fall of man, and it is a harsh, tragic world. Okay, and this occurred at the fall when they also awakened to self-consciousness, to the understanding of future, to the understanding of higher things, of meaning, the meaning of the universe. First is the terrible fate awaiting us in the post-paradise world, in the world of history. Okay, so the fall of man happened, and here's the world, and the first problem is we now live in history in a harsh world. Not the least of which is what Goethe called our creative endless toil. So, the terrible fate, meaning what is going to happen to us when we get after paradise, well, one of the things is we are going to have to work. Toil is work. So not the least, meaning maybe one of the big things, was that we must endlessly toil. The post-paradisal world is a world of work that never ends. Humans work, as we have seen. We work because we have awakened to the truth of our own vulnerability, our subjugation to disease and death. This is again the same thing we saw in the previous paragraph that I had in red. Tragedy motivates us to work. So I'm going to do this in red because it's the same idea as that last one. Hold on. We work because we have awakened to the truth of our own vulnerability, our subjugation to disease and death, and we wish to protect ourselves for as long as possible. This is the idea that tragedy motivates work because that's the best way to protect ourselves. Once we can see the future, we must prepare for it. So that's sacrifice and work. Or if we don't prepare for it, we will live in denial and terror. Denial is like, oh, it's not going to happen. We're fine. That's denial. And terror is just fear. So if we don't work, we will be in a state of fear and closing our eyes and denying all of the bad tragedies that are about to come. We therefore sacrifice the pleasure of today for the sake of a better tomorrow. So we do this because we are self-conscious and aware of the future. We give up eating all the food today in favor of saving some to plant so that we can have a harvest next year. But here we go again. This is exactly like the last paragraph. The realization of mortality and the necessity of work is not the only revelation to Adam and Eve when they eat the forbidden fruit and when they wake up and open their eyes. They were also granted or cursed by the knowledge of good and evil. So here we have that thing again. In addition to the tragedy of the natural world, there will be the tragedy of evil. And then Jordan Peterson speaks and he says, "It took me decades to understand what that means, to understand even part of what it means. It's this. Once you become consciously aware that you yourself are vulnerable, you understand the nature of human vulnerability in general. You understand what it's like to be fearful and angry and resentful and bitter. You understand what pain means. And once you truly understand such feelings in yourself, how they are produced, you understand how to produce them in others. It is in this manner that the self-conscious beings that we are become voluntarily and exquisitely capable of tormenting others. And ourselves, of course, but it's others we're concerned about right now. We see the consequences of this new knowledge manifest themselves when we meet Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve. So let's look at this and get the main idea. All right, so when Adam and Eve fell, sinned, ate the apple, number one, the world was destroyed and became harsh and dangerous. Number two, Adam and Eve themselves became vulnerable. Instead of having, practically eternal life, they were subject to death. Also, in addition Well, they also became self-conscious. So then they understood the future and the need to prepare for it and the need to work in order to stave off the suffering that would come from the harsh world. So all that happened. We need sacrifice, we need work in order to keep ourselves safe. All that happened in the fall of man. But one more thing happened. They were granted or cursed by the knowledge of good and evil. And what does that mean? It took Jordan Peterson decades to understand what it meant. That Adam and Eve were cursed or blessed with the knowledge of good and evil. It means that a person who is aware, consciously aware, when they experience their own vulnerability, when they experience that they are vulnerable, then they begin to understand what makes people vulnerable. So they begin to understand the nature of vulnerability in general. So once they experience suffering for themselves, they learn what causes it. And as soon as they know what causes it, then they can understand how they could cause it in others. So as soon as you are hurt, you say, wow, I can use this knowledge to hurt someone else if I want. So a self-conscious being becomes an agent of suffering and evil. They begin to intentionally hurt other people. And this is evil. They gain the knowledge of how to hurt others because they themselves have been hurt, and then they are self-conscious and reflective, so they think about it and they figure out how they were hurt, so then they can do it to someone else. That's what he's saying. Once you become aware that you yourself are vulnerable, then you understand the nature of vulnerability in general. You understand what it's like to be fearful, angry, and resentful and bitter. You understand pain. And once you truly understand these things in yourself and how they're produced in yourself, then you understand how to produce them in others. It is in this manner that the self-conscious beings that we are become voluntarily and exquisitely, voluntarily capable of tormenting others. So we choose to learn how to be evil because we have suffered and we learn how to do it to someone else. And this is all part of the fall. Knowledge of good and evil. We see the consequences of this new knowledge manifest themselves in Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve. So this is the next story in the Bible. Right after the fall, we get Cain and Abel. By the time of their appearance, mankind has learned to make sacrifices to God. I think I'm going to get myself green. Okay. On altars of stone designed for that purpose, a communal ritual is performed, and the immolation of something valuable, a choice animal or a portion thereof, and its transformation through fire to the smoke, to the spirit, that rises to heaven above. In this manner, the idea of delay is dramatized so that the future might improve. Abel's sacrifices are accepted by God and he flourishes. Cain's, however, are rejected. He becomes jealous and bitter. These are some of the emotions that were mentioned in the last paragraph. He becomes jealous and bitter. And it's no wonder. If someone fails and is rejected because he refused to make any sacrifice at all, well, at least that is understandable. He may still feel resentful and vengeful, but he knows in his heart that he is personally to blame. That knowledge generally places a limit on his outrage. It's much worse, however, if he had actually foregone the pleasures of the moment, if he had strived and toiled and things still didn't work out, if he was rejected despite his efforts, then he's lost the present and the future. Then his work, his sacrifice, has been pointless. Under such conditions, the world darkens and the soul rebels. So let's read it again one more time. So, by the time of their appearance, meaning Cain and Abel's appearance, by the time Cain and Abel were born, mankind has learned to make sacrifices to God. On altars of stone designed for that purpose, a communal ritual is performed. So this is how they did it. The immolation, that means burning, the burning of something valuable, a choice animal or a portion thereof. So an animal or a piece of an animal. And its transformation through fire to smoke, which signifies the spirit. So you take an animal and you turn him into smoke by means of fire. So you're taking something you could eat now and you're turning it into the spirit of it, the smoke, and giving it up to God. The idea being in the future it will come back and you can eat it then. In this manner, the idea of delay is dramatized, so delaying gratification, so that the future might improve. Abel's sacrifices are accepted by God, and he flourishes. Flourishes means everything good happens to Abel. All good luck happens to him. He is blessed, and his sacrifice is accepted by God. Cain's sacrifice, we have our possessive, and it refers to this word, so it's left out. Cain's sacrifice, however, so something different, is rejected. So Abel's are accepted, Cain's are rejected. By the way, the story does not tell us how we know they were rejected. He, meaning Cain, becomes jealous of Abel. That's when you hate someone for their good fortune. And bitter, so he's mad. And it's no wonder. So that means we understand why it is justified that he would become jealous and bitter. Anyone would. And now we go into a hypothetical. If someone fails and is rejected because he refused to make any sacrifice at all. So, in other words, if Cain had come to God with no sacrifice and then got rejected, well, That's understandable. That person who didn't make a sacrifice, he may still feel resentful and vengeful. Resentful means angry. Vengeful means wanting to hurt someone else, to take revenge. But he may feel those bad emotions, but he knows in his heart that he is personally to blame. So if you go to God with no sacrifice and he rejects you, you may get angry, but you know it's your fault. That knowledge generally places a limit on his outrage. So he will be mad, but he won't be very mad because he knows it's his fault. However, something different. It's much worse. I should give a different color. Oh well. It's much worse. We'll go to yellow. It's much worse if the man had actually foregone the pleasure. So he did make a sacrifice. He gave up pleasure of the moment. If he had strived, that means tried real hard. Toiled, that means worked real hard. And things still didn't work out. And he was rejected, despite his efforts. Despite, we can also say, in spite of. It's a word we use when you are expecting and entitled to one result and the opposite occurs. Then that opposite is occurring in spite of all of the good reasons for your success. Then that man has lost the present and the future. He lost the present when he strove is past tense for strive, and toiled. At that point, he was losing his present. And then, when he was rejected, he lost his future also. So this man, his work and his sacrifice were pointless. They were useless. They were lost. Under such conditions, under these conditions, the world darkens and the soul rebels. So, it is one thing to be rejected when you have done something wrong, but it is another thing to be rejected when you have worked and tried. And Cain knew that type of anger. So we see Cain is outraged by his rejection. He is angry at God. He is outraged by his rejection. He confronts God, meaning he speaks to him. He tells him how angry he is. He confronts God. He accuses him. That means he says, "You are bad. You are wrong." And he curses his creation. "Everything you did was bad. Why have you made the world this way?" That proves to be a very poor decision. When they say that proves to be, that means as the story goes forward, we can see that to do this was a bad idea. So, in the end, that proves to be a very poor decision. God responds. So God speaks back to him in no uncertain terms. That means in English, we have a double negative, no uncertain. That means it's a positive in certain terms. God responds to him with no ambiguity, no uncertainty, very strongly and firmly, that the fault is all with Cain. So Cain said, "It's your fault, God." And God said, "No, it is your fault entirely." And worse, that Cain has knowingly and creatively dallied with sin. So God says that Cain has knowingly, meaning on purpose, dallied with sin. Dallied means spent a little time thinking about it and entertaining it, and not putting it away. So God is accusing Cain of being kind of active in considering a sinful life. Dallying with sin is not like going for it. It's just like entertaining the temptation, the thought. So, God says that it's all Cain's fault and that he has been intentionally messing with sin. And that Cain has reaped the consequences. Reap is the word when you take in the harvest of everything you have planted. So he has harvested bad results from his bad actions. This is not at all what Cain wanted to hear. It is by no means an apology on God's part. So by no means is an emphatic no. It is not an apology. By no means. It is not an apology. See, Cain is like, "You're wrong. You need to apologize to me." And God is like, "No, you're wrong. You have intentionally sinned, and it is your fault that you are having this bad result." This makes Cain very angry because God is not apologizing. Instead, that's like another however. Instead of apologizing, God is insulting Cain. It's insult added to injury. We have a phrase in English, to add insult to injury. So injury is when something has been done to you, like you lost money or you got hurt. Insult is just disrespect. So apparently Cain had some loss associated with his rejection. And then God insulted him on top of it. Cain, embittered to the core by God's response, plots revenge. So he is embittered to the core, meaning very deeply angry because of God's response to him. So he plots revenge. He makes a bad plan. He defies the Creator audaciously. So he's going to do the very worst thing right in front of God. It's daring. Cain knows how to hurt. He's self-conscious after all. And he has become even more so, even more self-conscious in his suffering and shame. So, he murders Abel in cold blood. In cold blood means with no pity. Very cruel. He kills his brother, his own ideal. The brother is Cain's ideal. The brother is what Cain should be and tried to be and failed and was rejected. So when he kills his brother, he is killing his own ideal, his own model for what he should be. It is like rejecting goodness, killing goodness. He commits this most terrible crime to spite himself of all mankind and God himself all at once. We have a phrase in English, you are cutting off your nose to spite your face. Spite, it's to injure symbolically. Sometimes there's a little bit of actual injury, but mainly it's a symbolic injury. So he commits this terrible crime just to symbolically injure God and himself by murdering his own ideal. He does it to wreak havoc and gain vengeance. What better way to hurt God than to kill his brother and spiritually himself at the same time? It is like murder-suicide. He does it to register his fundamental opposition to existence, to protest the intolerable vagaries of being itself. I'm going to do this. He does it to register his fundamental opposition to existence, to protest the intolerable vagaries of being itself. It is like saying, God, the world you have made sucks, and I hate it. That is what this action says. It is like spitting on the world God has made and on God himself. And Cain's children, the offspring, as it were, of his body and his decision, are worse. So the bad, the evil, it gets bigger as it goes down the line of history. So his natural children and also his spiritual children, meaning others who reject God, reject being, reject the world God has made. In his existential fury, Cain kills once. Lamech, his descendant, goes much further. He says, I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, Lamech 70 and sevenfold. So Lamech is even more bold and not sorry, unashamed of his own evil. He's arrogant in his evil. Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron, is, by tradition, 7 generations from Cain, and he is the first creator of weapons of war. And next in the Genesis story comes the flood. The juxtaposition is by no means accidental. Let's stop there. We're out of time. See you next week. Kind of a down note to end on, but it is what it is. See you later.